And nobody seems to have the original ad anymore. And I'm talking about print ads in this case.
Sure. I'm flipping through my basically the topics that we have here to talk about are things like which document types you're looking at, which we've covered, and the important features of these, which we've talked about a bit, how you might want them stored, how they're shared, and what sort of how you'd go and search for them as well.
Yeah.
And we're sort of talking about each of these, which is fantastic. I'm just going over my script now to think about where we might want to focus our last few minutes. We have about 18 minutes left in the original hour. Actually, maybe, do you mind if I ask you if I sort of jump topic and talk to you more about the other thing I'm working on? So the identity research. I was just looking at your most cited article here again, which I had run across in my previous research, which is it's the "Do You Identify as a Gamer" article from New Media and Society, which is sort of almost what I'm looking at.
Okay.
In my general exam, what I have just proposed as a study is a look at the content of game-related identities, but to see how they're functioning, if they're functioning as role identities, if they're functioning as group identities, or as material identities. I'm not sure if you normally look at identity in those frameworks. You mentioned gender and sexuality, and some of those are, I guess, those would be group and role identities. Have you, and you also talk about collections. So I don't know, I guess I sort of want tips. It's because my advisor is working on this IT identity, how we incorporate the functionality, how we incorporate information technology into our sense of self. And because I'm interested in the game industry, my thought is that I need to look at the practice of game companies hiring gamers and see how that affects production in ways that, say, somebody building a financial package who doesn't necessarily hire somebody who is really a fanatical financial person would affect the process. And my thought is that in order to have a better idea of what's going on, I should really analyze some of these identities. What does it mean to be a software developer? What does it mean to be a gamer? And look at how these are functioning.
Right.
Does this make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, I mean, have you read Casey O'Donnell's book, Developer's Dilemma?
I have a copy and I haven't read it yet. I've acquired it recently.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things that Casey talks about, he and I are actually like the only two people who had studied the game industry in India, and we studied it like 3 years apart and ended up independently of each other interviewing all the same people because the Indian game industry is just like that small. And one of the things we both found while we were there, and that he talks a bit about in that book, is that especially in India, the game development companies like all had these rooms that were full of like a bunch of consoles. So like in off hours or at lunchtime or something, workers could go play with them to like learn about games because game consoles especially arrived really late in India compared to everywhere else. But the game industry arrived much faster by comparison because of a lot of outsourced labor via the tech industry. And so there's a sense of like, we have people who know all the technical stuff, but we need them to have better game literacy. And so like it was like your job to go play games to like learn what they were, to learn how to make better games, which is so different than the US model, which it's much more about like cultural fit. And one of the things Casey talks about in the book specifically is like the way people he interviewed who work in the US game industry would talk about it is like, we need to be able to use references to sort of quickly move through meetings. So if I say, oh, like they did in Mario 2 with this character.
Hmm.
Everybody should know what I mean so that we don't actually have to spend time describing what that looked like. Which is very exclusionary, which is one of the things Casey is addressing by pointing it out. It's like this idea that it's better if I like toss out a theorist and we all know who that theorist is, so I don't actually have to explain who Foucault is if I'm trying to explain this other point, which is what I'm actually trying to get to.
Hmm.
So I think that would work would be really useful.
It
And
strikes me
also,
that,
go ahead.
sorry. Well, it strikes me that also, have you read Sutton Smith?
Yes.
All right. So one of the things I had never considered until I read Sutton Smith was games as colonization or
Hmm.
play as colonization. So it strikes me that that's also what that does is it reinforces existing basically Japanese and American versions of what games should be
Hmm.
onto these other communities that are learning to build games. One of the projects that I think would be fantastic is if I could find basically indigenous forms of digital play.
Mm.
Right? How do you find people who have taken the tools that have generally been used to develop technology, but are using them in more, I guess, decolonized methods? This is
Mm.
not my area of expertise. I really need
Yeah.
somebody who understands a bunch of this critical theory
Hmm.
stuff better than I to help me with this. So I'm,
Yeah. I mean, there
fortunately,
are.
the I school is very interdisciplinary. Um,
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I feel like, and I'm just gonna totally blank on the name of the person, but I went to a conference, it was like over a decade ago now, in Australia, and one of the projects that was presented was this like effort to create games, for Aboriginal communities about their own histories, which is sort of like taking the tools but using them in very different ways.
mhm.
Um, and there are similar projects, especially, and again, I'm totally blanking on the names, but in Utah, I know that there are people who are members of Native American tribes also using gameplay to preserve their language, um, and like trying to incorporate elements of the culture into that. So there are people who are doing work around
Mhm.
that. I think the best person to sort of contact is Beth Lenapace, who's a Native American game designer, who got a bunch of flack for a game she made on um, uh, protecting land from pipelines and oil drilling and things like that. But she has, I think, written the most about it and thought about it.
Great.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, I think she would be the best place to start, and she would probably know these other like projects that are just sort of floating around in my head as things I've heard at conferences.
So aside from this, uh, do you identify article? Which
Mm-hmm.
of your articles do you think that I should look at most as I look at gamer identities?
I mean, for gamer identities, I think that piece, there's also a piece in Ada called On Not Becoming Gamers that's related. It's based on the same data, but is coming at it from a different theoretical angle, which is like the utility of using gamer as an identity in game study, as a focus in game studies in the first place. But if you're looking at game production cultures, I actually think the things I've published on the Middle East and India, which I can just send you the PDFs of all of this. It's the benefit of going up for 10 years. Like all of my stuff is in one place now.
Well, good luck.
I
Are
mean,
you
there's
through
also
it?
yeah, I got through it
Well,
this past summer.
congratulations.
Thank you. Like the benefit of tenure is actually getting tenure, but like the benefit of the process is having all your stuff in one place and readily accessible. But I think that the discussion of like game production in non-US context might be useful to think about how people are thinking about themselves as gamers or not when they make games.
Hmm.
And then Casey O'Donnell's work, definitely. Don't tell him this if you ever talk to him, but I don't love the structure of Developer's Dilemma, but there are a lot of good bits in there if you get over the way he was very attached to his structure, which is set up in like a very nerdy designer way, as opposed to like something that I find like a good book. It has good content, but like the structure,